In the marble corridors of Renaissance Florence, where power shifted like shadows at dawn, Niccolò Machiavelli understood a truth that would echo through centuries: the greatest strength lies not in what one can take, but in what one no longer needs. This principle, woven through the fabric of his political philosophy, reveals itself as the ultimate form of power, a force so complete that it requires neither validation nor demonstration. The concept emerges from a profound understanding of human nature and the mechanisms of control. When we examine the lives of those who have wielded true influence throughout history, a pattern emerges that transcends wealth, position, or physical strength. These individuals possessed something far more valuable: the ability to operate from a place of complete internal sufficiency, needing nothing from the external world and, therefore, being immune to its manipulations. Consider the merchant prince who built his empire not through desperate grasping for wealth, but through careful calculation and the understanding that each transaction was merely a step in a larger design. He did not need the approval of his peers, nor did he require their validation of his methods. This independence from external validation created a psychological fortress that no enemy could breach, for there was nothing they could threaten that he had not already prepared to lose. The foundation of this ultimate power rests upon a paradox that Machiavelli would have appreciated: to gain everything, one must be willing to need nothing. This is not the hollow asceticism of those who deny themselves pleasure out of fear or moral posturing, but rather the sophisticated understanding that attachment creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites exploitation. The man who has destroyed his weak self, that aspect of his nature that craves approval, fears judgment, and depends upon external circumstances for happiness, has effectively armored himself against every weapon that society might turn against him. In the political arena, this principle manifests as the ability to make decisions based purely on strategic necessity rather than emotional need. The weak ruler seeks popularity, approval, and the comfort of being liked. He shapes his policies to win applause and avoids difficult choices that might cost him social capital. This need for external validation becomes his greatest weakness, for his enemies need only threaten his reputation or social standing to control his behavior. The ruler who has mastered the art of needing nothing, however, can make the harsh but necessary decisions without regard for personal cost, because he has already accepted that cost as inevitable. The transformation from weakness to ultimate strength is not achieved through a single revelation but through a gradual process of internal destruction and reconstruction. It begins with the recognition that most human suffering stems not from external circumstances but from our attachment to specific outcomes. The man who desperately needs his business to succeed will make poor decisions driven by fear and desperation. The man who can accept failure as merely another form of information will make calculations based on probability and strategic advantage. This process requires the systematic dismantling of ego-driven motivations. The need to be seen as intelligent, successful, moral, or powerful must be examined and ultimately discarded. Each attachment represents a potential point of control that others can exploit. The businessman who needs to be seen as ethical can be manipulated through appeals to his moral vanity. The politician who needs to be seen as strong can be baited into foolish demonstrations of power. The scholar who needs to be seen as wise can be flattered into supporting ideas that serve others' interests rather than truth. The destruction of these needs does not create a cold, emotionless automaton but rather a being of unprecedented clarity and effectiveness. When decisions are no longer clouded by personal emotional investment, they can be made with crystalline precision. The general who does not need glory can choose retreat when it serves the larger strategy. The negotiator who does not need to win every point can concede strategically to achieve the ultimate objective. The leader who does not need love can make unpopular choices that serve the long-term good of his organization or people. Historical examples illuminate this principle across cultures and centuries. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, despite holding absolute power, cultivated a philosophy that emphasized the temporary nature of all external goods and the importance of inner self-sufficiency. His meditations reveal a man who had learned to find satisfaction not in the trappings of power but in the proper execution of his duties, regardless of personal cost or benefit. This internal independence allowed him to rule with a justice and effectiveness that earned him a place among history's most respected leaders. In the East, Sun Tzu's Art of War repeatedly emphasizes the importance of flexibility and non-attachment in strategic thinking. The general who is too attached to a particular plan or too invested in a specific outcome becomes predictable and, therefore, vulnerable. Victory belongs to those who can adapt fluidly to changing circumstances, abandoning previous investments without emotional hesitation when new opportunities present themselves. The merchant families of Renaissance Italy provide another model of this principle in action. Those who survived and thrived through centuries of political upheaval were not necessarily the most ruthless or the most wealthy, but those who had learned to operate with emotional detachment from their material possessions and social status. When circumstances required it, they could abandon a city, liquidate a business, or change allegiances without the paralysis that comes from excessive attachment to any particular identity or possession. This principle extends beyond individual psychology into the realm of relationships and social dynamics. The person who needs nothing from others paradoxically becomes the most valuable and sought-after companion. Because they offer their time, attention, and resources freely rather than as part of a desperate exchange, their company becomes genuinely pleasurable rather than burdensome. They can offer honest counsel because they have no stake in being liked for their advice. They can provide genuine friendship because they seek nothing in return. In romantic relationships, this dynamic creates an almost magnetic attraction. The individual who is complete within themselves, who genuinely needs nothing from a partner except the pleasure of their company, offers something rare in human connections: relationship without desperation, love without possessiveness, companionship without neediness. This emotional self-sufficiency creates space for authentic connection to develop, free from the distortions of mutual dependency and manipulation. The business world provides daily examples of how neediness creates vulnerability while self-sufficiency creates power. The salesman who desperately needs to make a sale will accept unfavorable terms, make excessive concessions, and ultimately damage his long-term position for short-term relief. The salesman who approaches each opportunity with genuine detachment from the outcome can negotiate from a position of strength, walking away from poor deals and thereby earning respect and better opportunities. Similarly, in negotiations of all kinds, the party that needs the agreement less invariably holds the superior position. This is not merely because they have better alternatives, but because their lack of emotional investment allows them to think clearly, assess situations accurately, and make decisions based on actual value rather than psychological pressure. The negotiator who has destroyed his need to be seen as successful, his attachment to any particular outcome, and his fear of failure becomes nearly impossible to manipulate through conventional pressure tactics. The transformation from neediness to self-sufficiency requires honest self-examination of the subtle ways in which ego and attachment influence behavior. Most people are unaware of how much their daily choices are driven by the need for approval, the fear of criticism, or the attachment to particular identities and roles. The businessman may believe he is motivated by profit, but closer examination reveals he is actually motivated by the need to be seen as successful by his peers. The artist may believe she creates for the love of beauty, but investigation shows she is primarily driven by the need for recognition and validation. This self-examination must be ruthless and ongoing, for the ego is remarkably creative in finding new forms of attachment and new sources of need. The person who successfully destroys one form of neediness may unconsciously develop another. The businessman who overcomes his need for wealth may become attached to his reputation for philosophical wisdom. The leader who transcends his need for popularity may become dependent on being seen as above such concerns. The process of destroying the weak self is not accomplished through denial or suppression but through understanding and integration. Each need and attachment must be examined to understand its origin, its function, and its cost. The need for approval, for instance, often stems from childhood experiences of conditional love, where acceptance was contingent upon performance. Understanding this origin allows one to see that the adult world operates under different rules, and that seeking approval from others is often not only unnecessary but counterproductive. The attachment to material possessions frequently reveals itself under analysis to be an attachment to security or status rather than genuine appreciation for the objects themselves. Once this underlying motivation is understood, it becomes possible to enjoy material goods without being controlled by them, to pursue wealth without being enslaved by it, and to lose possessions without losing equanimity. The fear of failure, perhaps the most common source of human neediness, dissolves when one recognizes that failure is simply information about what doesn't work rather than a judgment about personal worth. The entrepreneur who can genuinely accept failure as part of the process rather than as a reflection of his character can take the calculated risks necessary for exceptional success. More importantly, he can admit mistakes quickly, change course rapidly, and learn efficiently because he is not defending his ego against the implications of being wrong. As this internal work progresses, external behavior begins to change in subtle but powerful ways. Conversations become more honest because there is less need to manage others' impressions. Decisions become clearer because emotional static no longer distorts the signal. Relationships improve because the desperate energy of neediness is replaced by the attractive energy of genuine interest and appreciation. The ultimate power that emerges from this process is not the ability to control others, but the immunity from being controlled by them. The person who needs nothing cannot be bribed, threatened, or manipulated through conventional means. He cannot be controlled through his vanity because he has none. He cannot be motivated through fear because he has accepted the worst-case scenarios. He cannot be bought because he is not selling anything, least of all his integrity or independence. This creates a curious paradox in social and professional settings. The individual who can truly take or leave any opportunity, relationship, or situation often finds that opportunities multiply, relationships improve, and situations resolve in his favor. This occurs not through any mystical law of attraction but through simple psychological dynamics. People are naturally drawn to those who seem complete and self-sufficient, and they instinctively avoid those who radiate need and desperation. In professional contexts, this manifests as what some call executive presence, the quality that allows certain individuals to command respect and attention without apparent effort. This presence is not about charisma or showmanship but about the deep confidence that comes from genuinely not needing anything from the situation or the people in it. The executive who is not desperate to be promoted, not attached to being right, and not invested in being liked can focus entirely on adding value and solving problems. This focus on contribution rather than extraction naturally attracts positive attention and creates opportunities. The political realm reveals this dynamic most clearly. The politician who desperately needs to be elected will say whatever he believes voters want to hear, promise what cannot be delivered, and compromise his principles for perceived advantage. He becomes a slave to public opinion polls and focus groups, shaped entirely by external pressures rather than internal conviction. The politician who has destroyed this need for approval can speak honestly about difficult realities, propose solutions that may be temporarily unpopular but ultimately beneficial, and maintain consistency of character regardless of political winds. History's most effective leaders often displayed this quality of not needing the position they held. They could threaten to resign without bluffing, could make unpopular decisions without political calculation, and could maintain their principles under pressure because their sense of self was not dependent on their role or title. This paradoxically made them more effective in their positions because they could use their power strategically rather than defensively. The military context provides perhaps the clearest examples of how destroying the weak self creates invulnerability. The soldier who has already accepted death as a possibility fights with a clarity and effectiveness impossible for one who is primarily concerned with survival. This is not reckless disregard for life but rather the understanding that excessive attachment to survival can paradoxically increase the likelihood of death through poor decision-making under stress. The samurai tradition codified this principle in the concept of dying before death, the psychological preparation that allowed warriors to act with perfect clarity in combat because they had already mentally accepted the worst possible outcome. This preparation freed their minds to focus entirely on effective action rather than being paralyzed by fear or clouded by hope. In the modern business environment, this principle translates into what some call strategic courage, the ability to make bold decisions because one has already accepted the possibility of failure. The entrepreneur who has truly internalized this mindset can pivot quickly when necessary, shut down failing ventures without emotional attachment, and pursue opportunities that others find too risky because they have not properly calculated the real cost of conservative inaction. The relationship between needing nothing and proving nothing reveals another layer of this ultimate power. Most human behavior is motivated, either consciously or unconsciously, by the desire to prove something to someone. The businessman works to prove his worth to his father. The artist creates to prove her talent to critics. The athlete trains to prove his superiority to competitors. These proof-seeking behaviors create predictable patterns that others can exploit. The person who has nothing to prove cannot be manipulated through challenges to his competence, questions about his courage, or doubts about his character. He has no need to respond to provocations because he seeks no validation from the provocateur. This creates an almost impenetrable psychological defense, for most social manipulation relies on triggering the target's need to prove something about themselves. In negotiations, this manifests as the ability to remain calm under pressure. The negotiator who needs to prove his skill will respond to challenges and provocations, often making concessions or revelations that damage his position. The negotiator who has nothing to prove can allow others to believe whatever they wish about his competence, intelligence, or resources while focusing entirely on achieving optimal outcomes. This principle extends to intellectual and creative endeavors as well. The scholar who needs to prove his intelligence will engage in academic showmanship that obscures rather than illuminates truth. The artist who needs to prove her creativity will produce work designed to impress rather than express. The researcher who needs to prove his worth will pursue projects that enhance his reputation rather than advance knowledge. The liberation from proof-seeking allows for pure focus on effectiveness and truth. The scholar can pursue unfashionable but important research without concern for academic politics. The artist can create authentically without regard for critical reception. The businessman can implement strategies that serve long-term goals rather than short-term impression management. The social dynamics surrounding someone who needs nothing and proves nothing often confuse and sometimes intimidate others. In a world where most people are driven by various forms of neediness and proof-seeking, the presence of someone who operates from genuine self-sufficiency can be unsettling. This person's refusal to engage in the usual games of social positioning and status competition can be interpreted as arrogance, when in fact it represents the opposite, such complete security in oneself that external validation becomes irrelevant. This misunderstanding sometimes leads to social challenges, as others may attempt to force the self-sufficient person into conventional patterns of behavior through criticism, exclusion, or other forms of social pressure. However, these tactics are ultimately ineffective because they rely on the target's need for social acceptance, a need that has been systematically dismantled. The person who has achieved this level of internal independence often finds that social relationships naturally sort themselves. Those who are comfortable with authenticity and direct communication are drawn closer, while those who prefer manipulation and status games gradually distance themselves. This natural selection process results in a social environment of higher quality and lower maintenance, populated by people who appreciate honesty and competence over artifice and positioning. In leadership positions, this dynamic creates what can initially appear to be isolation but ultimately proves to be clarity. The leader who needs nothing from his subordinates can give honest feedback, make difficult personnel decisions, and maintain appropriate boundaries without the emotional complications that arise from neediness. His team learns to trust his judgment because they understand that his decisions are not colored by personal agenda or emotional manipulation. The economic implications of achieving this state of self-sufficiency extend far beyond personal finance into the realm of resource allocation and strategic planning. The business owner who has destroyed his attachment to material possessions can make decisions based purely on economic logic rather than ego protection. He can close profitable but ultimately limited ventures to pursue more promising opportunities. He can reduce personal consumption to increase business investment. He can liquidate assets without emotional trauma when strategic circumstances require it. This emotional detachment from material outcomes allows for what economists call optimal resource allocation, the deployment of resources in ways that maximize long-term value rather than short-term emotional satisfaction. The investor who is not attached to being right can sell losing positions quickly and buy assets that others avoid due to emotional aversion. The employer who is not attached to being liked can hire based on competence rather than personal affinity and terminate based on performance rather than emotional comfort. The time horizon for decision-making naturally extends when immediate emotional needs are removed from the equation. The person who needs nothing today can invest in outcomes that will not manifest for years or decades. He can sacrifice short-term profits for long-term market position, endure temporary criticism for eventual vindication, and work on projects that may not yield recognition within his lifetime. This extended time horizon creates a competitive advantage in almost every field of endeavor. While others are focused on quarterly results, immediate gratification, or rapid validation, the self-sufficient person can play a longer game with higher ultimate stakes. The politician who is not concerned with immediate popularity can support policies that require time to demonstrate their value. The researcher who is not seeking quick publication can pursue fundamental questions that may take decades to resolve. The paradox of abundance through detachment reveals itself most clearly in the realm of relationships and opportunities. The person who genuinely needs nothing from others often finds himself surrounded by people eager to give him what he does not seek. This occurs because neediness repels while self-sufficiency attracts. People instinctively move away from those who want something from them and move toward those who offer value without strings attached. In romantic relationships, this principle creates what might be called attractive independence. The person who is complete within themselves offers partnership rather than dependency, enhancement rather than completion, choice rather than necessity. This transforms the entire dynamic of romantic connection from negotiation to appreciation, from transaction to gift. Professional relationships follow similar patterns. The colleague who needs nothing from his peers can offer genuine help, honest feedback, and reliable support without hidden agendas. His presence in meetings improves the quality of discussion because he has no personal stake in particular outcomes beyond optimal results. His advice carries more weight because everyone understands he has no ulterior motive in offering it. The ultimate expression of this principle might be found in what could be called strategic invisibility, the ability to operate effectively while drawing minimal attention to oneself. The person who needs nothing and proves nothing has little incentive to broadcast his capabilities or achievements. He can work behind the scenes, avoid unnecessary conflict, and achieve his objectives without creating the resistance that often accompanies high-profile success. This invisibility provides multiple advantages in competitive environments. Competitors cannot effectively target someone whose methods, resources, and objectives remain unclear. Enemies cannot exploit psychological weaknesses that have been systematically eliminated. Allies cannot become dependent on support that might be withdrawn if circumstances change. The cultivation of strategic invisibility requires the discipline to forego credit, avoid spotlight, and resist the temptation to claim recognition for achievements. This runs counter to most people's instincts and social conditioning, which emphasize the importance of visibility for career advancement and social status. However, those who master this discipline often find that their actual influence and effectiveness far exceed their apparent position or reputation. In organizations, the strategically invisible person often becomes indispensable not through formal authority but through consistent competence and reliability. Superiors come to depend on their judgment, peers seek their counsel, and subordinates respect their fairness. This informal influence can be more powerful and durable than official position because it cannot be removed through reorganization or politics. The philosophical dimensions of achieving ultimate power through needing nothing extend into questions of purpose and meaning that have occupied thinkers throughout history. If one truly needs nothing and seeks to prove nothing, what motivates action? What provides direction and energy for life? The answer lies in the distinction between need and preference, between attachment and appreciation, between desperate grasping and purposeful engagement. The person who has destroyed his weak self does not become passive or directionless but rather gains access to motivations that were previously obscured by noise from neediness and ego. He can pursue excellence for its own sake rather than for recognition. He can serve others without expectation of gratitude. He can create value without requiring ownership of the results. This pure motivation often leads to achievements that surpass those driven by neediness because the absence of emotional interference allows for clearer thinking, better decision-making, and more persistent effort. The artist who creates solely for the love of creation often produces more moving work than one seeking fame. The scientist who pursues truth without regard for career advancement often makes more significant discoveries. The leader who serves without needing appreciation often achieves more lasting positive change. The concept of legacy transforms when viewed through this lens. Rather than seeking to be remembered or to ensure that one's contributions are recognized, the self-sufficient person focuses on making contributions that serve their intended purpose regardless of attribution. This shift from ego-driven legacy building to anonymous value creation often results in more significant and lasting impact because the energy that would have been spent on credit protection and reputation management is redirected toward actual effectiveness. The maintenance of this state of ultimate power requires constant vigilance, for the ego is remarkably persistent in its attempts to reassert itself through new forms of attachment and need. The businessman who successfully destroys his attachment to wealth may develop an attachment to being seen as spiritually advanced. The leader who transcends his need for popularity may become dependent on his reputation for independence. The artist who moves beyond seeking recognition may become attached to being misunderstood or underappreciated. These secondary attachments can be even more difficult to recognize and address because they often masquerade as virtues or higher motivations. The attachment to being humble, for instance, can create just as much inner turbulence and external vulnerability as the attachment to being recognized. The need to be seen as detached can become its own form of neediness, complete with defensiveness when the attachment is questioned. Regular self-examination becomes essential, not in the form of neurotic self-criticism but as honest assessment of motivations and reactions. The person committed to maintaining inner freedom learns to notice when his emotions become agitated by external circumstances, when his decisions begin to be influenced by others' opinions, or when his sense of well-being becomes dependent on particular outcomes. This ongoing maintenance work resembles the discipline required for physical fitness, a commitment to practices that maintain strength and flexibility over time rather than a one-time achievement that can be taken for granted. Meditation, philosophical study, honest self-reflection, and exposure to challenging situations all serve to strengthen the psychological muscles required for genuine independence. The culmination of this long process of development reveals itself not in dramatic displays of power or achievement but in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that one's well-being and effectiveness are not hostage to external circumstances. The person who has achieved this ultimate power moves through the world with a rare combination of engagement and detachment, caring deeply about outcomes while being emotionally independent of them. This state of being naturally inspires others, not through preaching or example setting but through the simple demonstration that such freedom is possible. In a world where most people live in various forms of psychological slavery to their needs, their fears, their attachments, their need for validation, the presence of someone who has achieved genuine independence serves as both inspiration and proof that liberation is achievable. The historical impact of individuals who embodied this principle extends far beyond their immediate sphere of influence. They serve as fixed points of reference in a world of shifting allegiances and changing fashions, offering stability and clarity that others can rely upon during uncertain times. Their influence often grows after their death because the principles they embodied, rather than the personality they displayed, continue to provide guidance and inspiration. The ultimate power that comes from needing nothing and proving nothing is not the power to control others but the power to control oneself. It is not the power to accumulate wealth but the power to remain uncontrolled by wealth or its absence. It is not the power to command respect but the power to respect oneself regardless of others' opinions. In destroying the weak self that craves external validation and fears external judgment, one becomes truly indestructible, not because no harm can come to the body or reputation, but because no harm can touch the essential core of being that has learned to find satisfaction and purpose independent of all external circumstances. The man who achieves this state has indeed destroyed his weak self, and, in doing so, has made himself immune to destruction by others. He has discovered the ultimate power that all external powers pale before, the power of absolute internal freedom. This is the gift that Machiavelli offered to those wise enough to understand his deepest teachings, not merely the tactics of political success, but the strategic wisdom of psychological invulnerability through the systematic elimination of all that makes one dependent upon the whims of fortune and the actions of others. In this lies perhaps the most profound insight of all: true power is not the ability to get what you want, but the freedom from wanting what you cannot control. The person who achieves this freedom has indeed become indestructible, for there is nothing left in him that can be broken by external force or circumstance. He has become the master of his own destiny not by controlling the external world, but by achieving complete independence from his need to control it.